Okay, so let's jump right in. When you look at Brazil, you see this really fascinating paradox. On the one hand, you've got what's known as the citizen constitution. I mean, this thing is one of the most progressive and detailed in the entire world. It guarantees a huge range of rights. But, on the other hand, you have a country that's still grappling with just profound inequality, and this daily struggle to make any of those rights a reality. We're going to dig into that gap, the huge space between the promise and the price.
You know, this quote from the sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, it just cuts right to the chase. It makes you ask a really fundamental question. What good is a right on paper if you can't actually use it in your life? That's really the core question we're going to be exploring here.
So, first things first, let's talk about the promise itself. You have to remember, Brazil was coming out of a brutal, 2-decade-long military dictatorship. So when they got the chance, they set out to write a constitution that would be a powerful shield, something to prevent those kinds of abuses from ever happening again, and to build a genuinely more just society.
Now, to really get how incredibly ambitious this constitution was, it helps to understand this idea of the generations of rights. It's not some perfect, neat timeline, but it's a really useful way to categorize rights based on the big historical fights that brought them into the spotlight. Okay, and what's really key to understand here is what these different rights demand from the government. So those first-generation rights, freedom of speech, the right to vote, they mostly just require the state to stay out of your business, to leave you alone. But second-generation rights, that's a whole different ballgame. Rights to health and education require the state to actively do something, to build schools, to fund hospitals, to create policies. And that, as you can imagine, is a much bigger and way more expensive commitment. And here we go. This says it all. Brazil's 1988 constitution didn't just stop with the basics. No, it went all in. It put these massive, second-generation social rights right there in black and white. It was this incredible, monumental promise to every single Brazilian. So, if the promise is that clear, why is the reality on the ground so incredibly different? Well, the first huge barrier is history. You can't just wipe the slate clean. That beautiful promise of 1988 was written on a foundation that was just deeply, deeply scarred by decades of authoritarian rule and state-sanctioned violence.
And this timeline really shows you the pattern. For a huge chunk of the 20th century, Brazil's experiments with democracy were constantly getting cut short. This stop-and-start cycle created a political culture where authoritarian habits, they got a chance to grow really deep roots inside state institutions.
During the military dictatorship, from 64 to 85, we have to be crystal clear about this. State violence wasn't an accident. It wasn't a bug. It was a feature. The entire security apparatus was basically designed to crush political opposition using torture, forced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. So, and this is the really crucial part, that legacy didn't just evaporate when democracy returned. It changed. It morphed. The old logic of targeting an internal enemy, which used to be political dissidents, was basically transferred onto marginalized groups, especially poor Black Brazilians in the cities. And this is what fuels this culture of impunity that makes that constitutional right to life and security feel, well, pretty abstract for a lot of people. Okay, so the second major barrier is money. It's the economic wall. It's that classic argument you hear, yeah, these rights are beautiful on paper, but come on, we simply can't afford to provide them for everybody. Just look at this number, 98%. Let that sink in for a second. Remember Article 6, that constitutional guarantee of education for all? Well, for 98% of young Black Brazilians, getting a higher education, a huge part of that promise, is still out of reach. It's a statistic that just screams about the massive gap between the law and the economic reality on the ground. So this brings us to a really important legal concept in Brazil, the Reserva do Possível, or the reserve of the possible. This is basically the government's official legal argument for why it can't always deliver on its promises. They argue that providing a right depends on what's actually, financially and practically possible. And this isn't just some vague excuse they can throw around. It's a legal doctrine with two very specific parts. The state has to prove, 1, that it factually doesn't have the money, and 2, that there isn't a law or a budget that authorizes the spending anyway. This creates this really high legal hurdle for regular citizens who are trying to demand their rights in court. It turns a fundamental human right into a debate about budget priorities. But, and this is so important, people in Brazil are not just passively accepting these barriers. Not at all. There is a constant, dynamic, and very real struggle going on, involving activists, everyday citizens, and even parts of the state itself, all trying to close that gap between the Constitution and real life.
And this fight is happening on a whole bunch of fronts. You've got social movements organizing and protesting to force issues onto the political agenda. You've got judges who are increasingly stepping in and ordering the state to provide specific things like life-saving medicine or a spot in a school. And then you have governments themselves, which have developed these huge policy tools to try and tackle poverty head-on.
One of the most famous examples of this is Bolsa Familia, which is a type of conditional cash transfer program. The idea here is pretty smart. It tries to fight poverty on two levels at once. It gives families immediate financial help, but it comes with strings attached. You have to keep your kids in school and get them their vaccinations. So it's both relief now and an investment in the future.
But of course, these programs are not without their critics. The philosopher Nancy Fraser's work is really helpful here. She argues that real justice isn't just about handing out money. That's redistribution. It's also about recognition, which means tackling the deep-seated discrimination and lack of respect that cause all that inequality in the first place. So critics argue that while these cash transfers are great for redistribution, they might not do enough to challenge those deeper problems. This brings us to a final and honestly crucial element in this whole fight for human rights. You have to confront that legacy of violence. To make sure the horrors of the dictatorship don't get repeated, societies often turn to a process that's known as transitional justice.
So the first pillar of this is memory. This is a collective commitment. It's society saying, we will not forget. In practice, this means building memorials, preserving archives, and teaching this history in schools so that future generations know exactly what happened and why it must never happen again.
The second pillar is truth, because it's not enough to just remember that bad things happened. The victims, their families, and all of society have a right to know the facts. Who was responsible for the torture, for the murders? Brazil's National Truth Commission, created back in 2011, was a huge step in this direction, officially documenting the crimes of the dictatorship for the historical record.
And that brings us to the third pillar, justice. And this is by far the most controversial and difficult one in Brazil. Justice means actually holding the perpetrators accountable in a court of law. The problem is, a 1979 amnesty law has been interpreted by Brazil's own Supreme Court as protecting state agents from being prosecuted. This creates a massive roadblock to justice, one that really clashes with international human rights law. And so all of this leaves us with a final lingering thought. The story of Brazil is this constant negotiation, isn't it? It's between these huge aspirations and these harsh limitations, between this profound commitment to human dignity on paper and the hard realities of history and economics. And it really forces us all to confront a very difficult question. When a government says it can't afford to provide a fundamental right today, at what point does that delay just become a denial?